The bells of St. Ethelred's were never meant to be rung in a hurry. They had been cast with patience, mounted with ceremony, and rung for decades with a self-conscious dignity that seemed to suit the character of Flaxborough. On Wednesday evenings the bell-ringers gathered with the regularity of a municipal habit, climbing the narrow stone steps of the tower in orderly pairs, nodding to one another with the restrained intimacy of men who knew each other's weaknesses but never mentioned them. It was at precisely 7 minutes past 7, a time deemed so correct by the Reverend Hargreaves that he often glanced at his watch to admire it, that the first unusual thing occurred. The bell of St. Ethelred gave one small, solitary strike. It was not part of practice, it was not part of anything. The men below in the ringing chamber paused in the curious way of people who sense a disturbance without yet granting it importance. Harold Timms, who rang the tenor and believed firmly that nothing in Flaxborough should ever be loud without reason, cleared his throat. "Bit early for that, isn't it?" he observed. No one answered immediately. The simple truth, that no one admitted to having pulled the rope, hovered gently in the stale, rope-scented air. Arthur Pelham, retired postmaster, lifelong bell-ringer, and unofficial custodian of the tower's moral atmosphere, smiled in the calm, patronizing fashion usually reserved for children and visiting bishops. "Settling noises," he said. "Old Timber likes to remind us it's still there." The men nodded, relieved. An unexplained noise, once politely explained, becomes unimportant. Flaxborough was very good at such arrangements. They set themselves to practice. The ropes swung, the bells rose and fell in their accustomed sequence, as predictable as rates demands, and as comforting as repetitive sermons. And then, 10 minutes into a perfectly respectable round, something else occurred. A rope did not return. The sound was wrong. Not louder, not sharper. Simply incorrect. In the way a single wrong word in a familiar prayer unsettles a congregation. The rhythm stuttered. Arthur Pelham's rope went slack. He pulled it experimentally, frowning with the mild indignation of a man whose cooperation had been taken for granted by an object. "Stuck?" Harold asked. Pelham frowned upward into the dark, timbered mouth of the tower. "Perhaps caught on something," he said, already reaching for his torch with that quiet excitement that comes of small interruptions to routine. The irony, though none of them would have enjoyed it, was that the bell rope was not caught at all. The body was. When Pelham climbed the ladder, torchlight dancing across beams, polished by years of careful looking and careful not looking, he expected to see a rope looped awkwardly around a beam, or perhaps tangled among the newer fittings that nobody quite trusted. What he saw instead was a foot, a polished shoe, dangling slightly unmoving. It was not a theatrical foot. It did nothing to announce itself. It hung there, quiet, modest, and disturbingly final. Arthur Pelham did not scream. Flaxborough men rarely did. Instead, he sat down very carefully on the nearest beam, turned off his torch, a gesture of unconscious courtesy, and said aloud to no one in particular, "Well now." By the time they had recovered him, a task conducted with rope, torchlight, and great respect for awkward angles, the curious truth had established itself in the air of the bell tower. No one was quite sure who he was. He wore a dark suit of reasonable tailoring. His pockets contained a neatly folded handkerchief, a small amount of loose change, and a membership card for the Flaxborough and District Antiquarian Society. There were no papers, no letters, no wallet. He had plainly not climbed up the tower by accident. He had just as plainly not fallen. The Reverend Hargreaves, who was summoned from his study while in the act of composing a sermon on the subject of restraint, stared at the body with muted distress. "This," he said gently, "is not conducive." By 9 o'clock, the police were called. By 9:15, the story had reached the butcher, the newsagent, the town's only shoe shop, and the ladies' section of Hartley's department store. By 10, it had become a scandal. By 10:30, it had become a tragedy. And by 11, it had acquired, as such matters often do in Flaxborough, motives, biographies, romantic complications, and a quiet suggestion that someone, somewhere, should really have noticed. Inspector Purbright arrived at 5 minutes to midnight. He stood in the church porch for a moment before going in, removing his hat as if in deference not to God, but to the building's opinion of him. He looked up at the tower. Nothing moved. Nothing ever looked more respectable than a crime in Flaxborough after dark. By breakfast time the following morning, Flaxborough had accepted the death in the bell tower with the calm readiness of a town that had long believed itself overdue for something faintly disgraceful. The stranger in the tower had ceased to be a body and had become a subject. It was discussed with the same careful relish that usually accompanied new net curtains, council rate adjustments, or the butcher's occasional enthusiasm for dubious sausages. At Hartley's department store, the gossip travelled between counters in a series of murmured refinements. "I heard he wasn't local at all," said Miss Denton, arranging gloves that no one under 60 bought any more. "Well, it stands to reason," replied Mrs. Crabb from haberdashery. "Otherwise someone would have seen him buying stamps or polishing his shoes." At Miller's newsagent, the tone became more pious. "Found him hanging," said Mr. Miller, with the air of a man who disapproved of dangling in general. "Not hanging," corrected a customer who read too many papers. "Caught. There's a difference." By mid-morning, the difference had grown elaborate. There was talk of secret meetings, foreign visitors, and something vaguely referred to as a society, which had taken on entirely new dimensions in the imagination of the ladies who ran the church flower rota. Meanwhile, the church itself wore its discomfort with dignity. Reverend Hargreaves drafted 2 versions of his incidental remarks for Sunday, one acknowledging distress and the other acknowledging uncertainty. He could not quite bring himself to admit the existence of death among the rafters. Inspector Purbright approached the matter as he approached most things, quietly, as though the town might be startled by sudden seriousness. He walked the high street at precisely 11 minutes past 10, a time he felt unlikely to offend anyone. He observed the butcher's aprons, the grocer's preference for melancholy displays, and the queue outside the bakery, which seemed more animated than usual. No one stopped him. That would have appeared forward. Instead, conversations bent gently around him like water around the stone of his presence. It was outside the antique shop that he first heard the stranger's occupation mentioned with conviction. "I dare say he was a dealer," said a thin woman who liked to be in the right before she was in the clear. "That sort of suit. And that card they found in his pocket." Purbright paused slightly, consulting the window as though the faded porcelain shepherd required his full attention. "Antiquarian," he said quietly, not to the woman, but to the air. "Yes, well, same sort of thing," she replied, satisfied by the vagueness. Inside the station, Sergeant Lovegrove had prepared the paperwork with an almost cheerful sense of local importance. A stranger, dead in unnatural circumstances, gave authority a certain new polish. "No name," Lovegrove said, tapping the file with restrained pride. "No papers, clean as a Sunday plate." Purbright sat down carefully. He disliked chairs that moved without permission. "Where did he come from?" he asked. Lovegrove gave the small shrug of a man who preferred events simple. "That's what we're trying to determine, sir." "Good. said Purbright. The first official opinion had already formed itself in neat alignment with the town's preference for tidy explanations. A stranger, an accident, perhaps a foolish climb undertaken for reasons no decent person would attempt to understand. That afternoon, the theory began to gather support. "He got lost," said the postmistress to the cleaner. "Train took him the wrong way, and he thought the tower was somewhere to wait." "It's happened before," the cleaner replied, who could not remember when, but felt it had. The evening brought another refinement of the scandal. Someone had noticed, or believed they had noticed, a stranger in Brown's tea rooms 2 days earlier. He had asked for plain bread and butter rather than scones, a detail that travelled with the thrill of evidence. The bell ringers themselves met, not to practice, but to worry in company. "He weren't one of us," said Harold Timms firmly. "Never seen him on the stairs." Arthur Pelham sat very straight, as men did when the ground had shifted of its own accord. "If he climbed," he said mildly, "he must have been invited, or very determined." No one liked that notion. Invitation suggested familiarity. Familiarity suggested blame. Purbright returned to the church just before dusk. The air had that particular quality of restraint that came just before the town slept properly. He climbed the tower steps alone, his footfalls slow, respectful, unhurried. The body had been removed, the ropes steadied, the beams left to their own dusty recollections. What remained was the wrongness. A faint scuff on one of the beams caught his attention. Barely visible, almost apologetic, as if someone had tried not to be noticed, even in the act of preparation. Below in the churchyard, Mrs. Topley told Mrs. Finch that the whole business was most unsettling, and that she always said the tower steps were dangerous. By nightfall, Flaxborough had done what it did best. It had transformed confusion into certainty. A stranger had come, a foolish man had climbed, a death had occurred, and everyone, from butcher to bell ringer, felt a little more interesting for having had it happen nearby. Behind them all, quiet as the tower at midnight, Purbright began to suspect that the town had decided the end of the story rather too early. The official discovery of death in Flaxborough was less a moment than a gradual acceptance. By Thursday morning, the body in the tower had acquired a label, the deceased, and with it a certain respectable distance. It ceased to be the awkward presence in the rafters and became a matter of forms, telephones, and gentle frowns exchanged across desks polished by generations of appropriate concern. Purbright stood in the small back room of the station, while Dr. Pym adjusted his spectacles with care. "Time of death?" Purbright asked. "Late afternoon or early evening," Pym replied, with the precise vagueness of a man who disliked being nailed to particulars. "Not long before the bells were rung." "So he was alive when he climbed?" "Almost certainly." That detail sat quietly between them, like a dropped handkerchief no one rushed to pick up. The man lay on the narrow table under a sheet, fully dressed, entirely respectable and thoroughly troublesome. There were no wounds worth excitement, no dramatic marks to satisfy the town. His neck showed pressure, but not the sort associated with a resolute act. More the slow, clumsy insistence of rope and weight, time and circumstance. "It wasn't tidy," Pym said. Purbright inclined his head. He had not expected tidiness. Outside, the high street resumed its careful breathing. Shopkeepers stood in doorways with faint expressions of useful sorrow. Customers asked after details as casually as they asked after bacon. "They say he wasn't hanging proper," said Mrs. Latch, buying a quarter-pound of butter she did not need. "They say a lot of things," replied the grocer, who enjoyed facts only when they wrapped neatly. By midday, the Antiquarian Society's name had become the town's newest fascination. Its members, normally invisible creatures who met to discuss damp cellars and indistinct pottery, found themselves suddenly interesting. At the Society's modest office, above a shop that sold postcards of things no one remembered, Mr. Cyril Daunt stood his ground. "We've had no visitors," he said firmly to Purbright. "No special meetings, no gentlemen ringing bells." "Mr. Purbright prompted. "Daunt," he said, with the satisfaction of a man who liked his own consonants. "Secretary." "You recognize the name?" Purbright asked, offering the membership card gently, as if it might blush. Daunt adjusted his spectacles. "It's genuine," he said, "but the number's odd. Too new for the name, too old for the card." He did not like this disturbance of logic. Neither did Purbright. At the station again, Sergeant Lovegrove found himself in an uncomfortable position. The theory of a simple accident had stiffened into something less obliging. "No ladder marks," he said apologetically. "No footprints on the dust that make sense." Purbright examined the man's shoes. One sole showed unusual wear, rubbed smooth in a narrow curve. "He climbed before," Purbright said mildly, more to himself than to Lovegrove. The sergeant stiffened. "There've been no break-ins up the tower, sir." "I wasn't thinking of this tower," Purbright replied. That evening, the bell-ringers gathered again, not to ring, that had been quietly postponed, but to sit in the draughty vestry and persuade themselves that they had done everything properly. "He wasn't there last week," Harold insisted. Arthur Pelham, who had spoken the least since the discovery, folded his hands with exaggerated care. "There was someone on the stairs," he said at last. Silence met the admission. "I thought he was a visitor," Pelham added gently. "Sometimes they come, you see, to listen." "You never said," Harold pointed out. "I didn't think it mattered." In Flaxborough many things did not matter until they very much did. Reverend Hargreaves retired early that night and slept badly. He dreamed of ropes that did not end, of bells that rang without hands. Across the green, Mrs. Topley wrote a letter to her sister that contained more truth than evidence. "He wasn't one of ours," she wrote, "which makes it worse." Purbright walked the churchyard alone at dusk. The mist lay thinly over the stones, behaving itself. He paced the path around the tower, his steps unhurried. Something about the dead man's pockets remained with him, the handkerchief neatly folded, the coins arranged as if by habit, the membership card handled often enough to crease, not often enough to wear. The kind of man who belonged somewhere, even if he wasn't known here. He looked at the tower again. "It requires effort," he murmured, "not the climbing, the decision." Behind his quiet eyes a new possibility stirred, not accident, not folly, arrangement. By the time he returned to the station, Lovegrove was waiting with a small triumph, dressed as boredom. "Found someone who saw the stranger, sir? Properly saw him?" Purbright removed his hat as he listened. "A man from the railway buffet," Lovegrove continued, "says he spoke to him." "Where?" "On the platform, 2 afternoons ago." The dead man had been in Flaxborough before he died, not lost, not wandering, waiting. And somewhere between the bell tower and the railway buffet, the truth began to shift its weight. The railway buffet smelled of boiled tea, damp wool, and the quiet despair of men who had never intended to spend their lives serving lukewarm refreshments to people going elsewhere. It was here, amid curling steam and chipped saucers, that the first sensible theory of the stranger's death was born. "I remember him clear enough," said Mr. Wilkes, whose memory improved in direct proportion to the attention it received. "Sat by the window, didn't eat much?" Purbright sat opposite him, hands folded, listening with the stillness that made other men feel encouraged to talk. "What did he ask you?" Purbright asked. Wilkes sniffed. "Asked about the church tower, said he liked old bells." "Only that?" "Well," Wilkes added, after a pause that suggested the careful manufacture of recollection, "he asked how to get up there. I told him it was usually locked." "Usually?" "Sometimes left open for practice." It was enough. By lunchtime the story had developed a spine, and by tea it had flesh enough to be believed by those who preferred belief to uncertainty. The man had been curious. He liked bells. He climbed where he should not. He died as a result. It was clean. It was tragic. It was, most importantly, comfortable. At the station, Sergeant Lovegrove arranged the evidence into something resembling order. He took a quiet pleasure in the way events lined up, when nudged firmly. "Looks like misadventure, sir," he said. Purbright nodded faintly. "So he went up there alone, rope caught, and that was that." There was a silence, which Lovegrove misunderstood as agreement. "That'll sit well with the coroner," the sergeant added. "Stranger? Accident? Unfortunate business?" "Yes," said Purbright. "It often does." At the council offices the matter was discussed with relief, carefully disguised as civic responsibility. "We don't want talk of violence," said Councillor Grimshaw. "Bad for confidence." "Bad for tours," added another man who had once unsuccessfully attempted to attract visitors with a pamphlet about Flaxborough's quiet charm. By the afternoon, the town had embraced the story as one might adopt a stray cat, grateful for the drama but determined to keep it tidy. At Hartley's, Mrs. Crabb adjusted her tone. "I expect he overbalanced," she told no one in particular. "Clumsy, I imagine." At the shoe shop, it gained moral shape. "Climbing about where he wasn't invited," said the assistant. "Asks for trouble." Even Arthur Pelham, who had seen more than he admitted, felt the pressure of certainty. "There's comfort," he said softly to Harold Timms, "in thinking it was just foolishness." Harold nodded. Comfort was valuable. That evening, Purbright walked the tower steps again. He did not touch the ropes this time. He stood very still, allowing the place to tell him what it could. Accident hung in the air like incense. He could almost hear the town breathing easier. And yet, the scuff mark remained. The beam did not forget. The rope itself, carefully coiled now by men who wished for normality, lay in a curve that suggested patience, not the patience of wood and fibre, but of habit. Elsewhere, Flaxborough began to pull the story into its proper shape. Reverend Hargreaves composed a phrase, a sad misfortune involving a wandering stranger. It sat well on the tongue. Miss Denton explained to a customer that you couldn't go climbing towers these days, not without asking. The railway buffet added a new detail. The dead man had looked agitated. This travelled quickly. Agitation sat nicely with foolish climbing. In the station, Lovegrove began his report in pen rather than pencil. Then late in the afternoon, something else occurred. A woman came forward who had not been consulted. Her name was Mrs. Elspeth Farrow, and she had the sort of face that belonged to a woman who noticed more than she was invited to. She spoke to Lovegrove first because he wore the uniform of responsibility. "I saw him," she said. "At the station?" Lovegrove asked, already prepared. "No," she replied. "At the tower?" That unsettled him. "When?" "Late afternoon, before the bells." "What was he doing?" "He wasn't climbing." She leaned slightly forward, as if enjoying for once the discomfort she was creating. "He was waiting." Lovegrove found Purbright immediately. "She's no troublemaker," he added defensively. "Keeps pigeons and minds her own business." Purbright listened without moving. "What did she see?" Lovegrove lowered his voice. He wasn't alone. Outside, Evening fell with its careful quiet. Shop fronts dimmed, curtains were drawn with a sense of duty. Flaxborough, satisfied with its neat conclusion, did not see the small crack beginning to show. Misadventure had solved everything, except that someone had been with the dead man, and that person, quietly, steadily, had slipped out of the story the town preferred to believe. Mrs. Elspeth Farrow did not enjoy being interesting, which made her, in Purbright's quiet estimation, a reliable witness. She sat in the station's hard chair with her handbag clasped as though it contained not personal effects, but moral principles. "I was feeding the pigeons," she said, because one always began with what was respectable. "They don't like change. They get unsettled." Purbright inclined his head slightly. He found this reasonable. "You saw the man by the tower," he said. "Yes." "Not climbing?" "No," she replied, a touch of satisfaction escaping despite herself. "Standing, looking up, as if waiting for someone to finish something." Lovegrove shifted behind his desk but said nothing. "And he was not alone?" "There was another man," she said. "Older, taller, wearing a hat I didn't like." This was the most severe criticism she could offer. "What didn't you like about the hat?" Purbright asked. She considered. It was too good for him. That lingered. By mid-morning, the theory of misadventure began to develop hairline fractures, nothing dramatic, just enough to let doubt through like a draft under a carefully fitted door. Purbright returned to the tower alone. The rope lay coiled where it had been returned by hands eager to restore normality. He touched it lightly, not with the attitude of a man testing evidence, but with that of someone greeting an old acquaintance he did not entirely trust. It was not frayed, the fibres were sound, old and well cared for, like most things in Flaxborough that were not talked about. He followed the rope upward with his eyes, tracing its quiet ascent into the dark. It was not the rope of a man who had fallen struggling. It was the rope of a man who had been helped. Behind him, a faint sound of shoes on stone. Arthur Pelham, who had grown tired of being respectable while being afraid, stood in the doorway. "I came to see," he said mildly, "if it still looked wrong." "Does it?" Purbright asked. Pelham studied the beam, the rope, the small, polite scuff mark. "Yes," he said. They stood together, men of quiet habits, regarding a silence that had acquired shape. "He wasn't a climber," Pelham added. "No," Purbright agreed. "He didn't struggle." "No." "He was—" Pelham searched for the phrase, arranged. Purbright did not correct him. Outside, Flaxborough entered that curious phase where certainty, having been embraced too loudly, begins to feel faintly embarrassing. The butcher, who had told 3 versions of the accident story before noon the previous day, now adjusted his tone. "Still, you don't know what a man's capable of when he's not local." At Hartley's, Mrs. Crabb lowered her voice. "There are things," she said, "that happen very quietly." In the council office, Councillor Grimshaw began to worry that perhaps the stranger had not died helpfully. He did not like the idea of unpleasantness attached to a civic building. Purbright walked past him without comment. At the railway station, Wilkes grew less confident. He added new details without being asked for them. The stranger had been nervous. The stranger had looked behind him. The stranger had kept checking a pocket that Wilkes had not previously observed. None of it rang cleanly. That afternoon brought the discovery of something nobody had thought to look at. A small brass token fell from the lining of the dead man's coat as Lovegrove lifted it for another inspection. It rolled across the table with a modest clink and came to rest by Purbright's hand. He picked it up. No markings, except a number, lightly worn. Not money, Lovegrove said. No, Purbright replied, not anything the town would recognize. He did not say where he thought it belonged, but the thought stayed with him. Across the green, Reverend Hargreaves attempted again to draft his Sunday remark. He crossed out accident and replaced it with mystery. It seemed nearer the mark. That evening, the bell-ringers gathered in the vestry. They sat with an air of men who suspected their hobby had developed opinions. Harold cleared his throat. If he didn't fall, he said, how did he get there? Arthur Pelham folded his hands. He was helped. They sat with this because it explained too much and too little at the same time. Purbright returned to the tower once more before nightfall. He examined the rung ladder closely, running his fingers along dust that had lain undisturbed for weeks. There were no frantic handprints, no marks of panic, only one faint indentation where someone had steadied himself, not in fear, but in compliance. Somewhere between the tower and the town, a new shape of truth was forming. The rope had not failed, the stranger had not fought. The misadventure was not miss, it was deliberate. Late in the evening, Lovegrove knocked on Purbright's office door. "We checked the token number, sir," he said. "Found a match." Purbright looked up. "A lodge hall on the edge of town." He rose slowly. The case, having dressed itself in respectability, had begun at last to show its seams, and Flaxborough, which disliked fuss, felt the first true stirrings of unease. The lodge hall lay at the very edge of Flaxborough, in that part of town where respectability grew thin, and the hedges were allowed to look faintly undecided about their duties. It was a square, pallid building with windows that had never quite committed to being clean, and a door that opened with the obedient reluctance of a man answering questions he did not wish to hear. Purbright arrived just before dusk, carrying the brass token in his gloved hand, as though it were nothing more than a misplaced library disc. Inside, the air tasted of cold tea, floor polish, and faded ceremony. Mr. Ambrose Kellett, caretaker and unappointed guardian of moral silence, blinked several times before settling on an expression of careful neutrality. "We don't get many visitors," he said. "I'm not visiting," Purbright replied gently. Kellett glanced at the token, and his eyes performed a small, involuntary retreat. "We don't keep lists," he said quickly. "Not formal ones." "No," Purbright agreed. "That would be untidy." The main room was arranged with plain chairs, a table that had never been accused of frivolity, and a small notice board with curling corners. On it hung announcements for lectures on local architecture, modest bridge evenings, and a recent meeting on historical locks of Lincolnshire and their emotional significance. It was here that the respectable men of Flaxborough gathered to feel quietly important. Names began to surface without being invited. Mr. Denton, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Crisp. Men who nodded correctly in church. Men who paid their rates on time. Men who had opinions about curtains. Purbright moved slowly, letting the place speak. There was a smell of old smoke on one curtain. He noticed it without appearing to. "You found something, didn't you?" Kellett asked, unable to bear the silence. "Perhaps," Purbright replied. By the following morning, the town had acquired a new discomfort. The lodge hall, previously unnoticed, became a source of remote fascination. "I always thought they were peculiar," said Mrs. Farrow to her pigeons. At Hartley's, Mrs. Crabbe lowered her voice again. "You don't know what men do when they lock doors." At the butcher's, speculation took on muscle. "They call it rituals," whatever that meant. Purbright began to collect silences. He spoke with Mr. Denton, who smelled of pipe smoke and desperation. "We're harmless," Denton insisted. just history-minded. You knew the stranger? Purbright asked. Denton smiled as though he had forgotten how. No. Hawley, who had once lost a council seat by 3 votes and had never forgiven the arithmetic, was more verbose. He came twice, Hawley admitted. Didn't speak much, just listened. Listened to what? To grievances. It was the plainest word anyone had yet used. In corners of the town, private resentments began to show their edges. Mr. Crisp had lost a small inheritance to a council decision 20 years before and had smiled ever since. Mr. Denton had once been publicly corrected by the dead stranger at a county lecture and had laughed while hating. Hawley disliked almost everyone as a matter of principle. Behind their respectable faces, a web of small injuries lay like cracks beneath polished varnish. That afternoon, a thin boy from the station brought Purbright something that looked like nothing. He handed it over shyly. "Found it by the hall, sir." It was a scrap of paper, folded twice, stowed carelessly inside a hedge, like a thought someone had abandoned. Purbright opened it carefully. A list of times, no names, just hours, days, and one word repeated in small, disciplined ink. Tower. The air in Flaxborough thickened, not with violence, with recognition. At the vestry the bell ringers sensed, without being told, that their tower had acquired a past it had not asked for. Arthur Pelham said nothing, but felt older. Harold polished a rope that did not need polishing. Inside the lodge hall, Kellett grew nervous in the quiet way of a man who realized he might know more than he wished to. That evening, Lovegrove arrived at Purbright's door with a new tone of voice. "We checked Hawley's statements, sir." "And?" Purbright asked. "He lies politely." It was the most Flaxborough sort of lie. "Something else," Lovegrove added. "Mrs. Farrow's right. There was another man, taller, hat too good for him." "Who?" Purbright asked. Lovegrove hesitated. A local name that stayed where it landed. Purbright walked alone again, past darkened windows and curtains that had been drawn with more care than usual. The town felt closer to its secret, and therefore more offended by it. He looked at the church tower. He thought of the rope. He thought of the list folded in the hedge. Not an accident, not a stranger's mistake, a gathering, a schedule. A man who had come at the wrong time, or perhaps the right one. Behind the stillness of Flaxborough, respectable men had been arranging things, and not all of them had enjoyed the result. By midnight, Purbright understood that the stranger had not been lost. He had been late. And in small rooms where flaking paint and polished lies coexisted peacefully, someone had begun to worry that the inspector's quiet footsteps were moving closer than they appeared. The second disturbance in Flaxborough did not arrive with noise, but with absence. It was discovered, as many important things in the town were, by accident and irritation. Reverend Hargreaves, entering the vestry on Saturday morning with the modest intention of checking the hymn board, found instead that the small oak cupboard behind the door had been emptied. Not ransacked, not broken, emptied. The curious thing was not what was taken, but what was left. The old registers remained. Spare candles sat untouched. The chipped chalice was where it had always been, looking faintly relieved. Only one item was missing, the old tower logbook. Hargreaves frowned at the space with the pained confusion of a man trying to remember whether he had ever truly approved of anything in that cupboard. He closed the door quietly, as though embarrassed by having noticed. By noon, Lovegrove knew. By 1 o'clock, Purbright knew. And by 2, Flaxborough sensed that something important had been interfered with, without quite knowing how. The quiet of the afternoon took on a new character. Previously it had been the quiet of respectability. Now it became the quiet of listening. At Hartley's, customers spoke in softer tones. "If someone's taken church records," whispered Mrs. Crabbe, "it can't be for anything nice." At the butcher's, a different interpretation flourished. Covering their tracks, the butcher announced to his cleaver. That evening, the lodge hall behaved oddly. A light burned when no meeting had been scheduled. A shadow moved across a blind that had not moved for years. Mr. Ambrose Kellett sat alone inside, reading a notice that had been pinned upside down without explanation. Elsewhere, a window was opened where no window should have been open. It belonged to Mr. Hawley. His curtains, which normally hung with military discipline, stood a fraction apart. A neighbour, who noticed everything except what he should, saw the movement and then chose, as decent people often do, to forget that he had. By late afternoon, the bell tower itself acquired a new quality. The rope that had been tidily coiled was no longer quite as tidy. The beam that bore the faint scuff now carried another, smaller mark, like an impatient foot placed too late. Arthur Pelham found it first. He said nothing, but his hands trembled as he folded his handkerchief into a square that had never previously required such attention. Purbright climbed the tower again at dusk. Without the logbook, the place felt more honest. Dust lay where it had been disturbed. A faint mark of a shoe sole crossed a patch that had been untouched for years. Someone had come back, not to look, to check. At the station, Lovegrove laid the small details out with an air that suggested he was only just beginning to enjoy being worried. "Hawley wasn't home this afternoon," he said. "Said he was at the station. Wilkes says he wasn't." "Anyone else?" Purbright asked. "Denton went for a walk. Crisp went nowhere but says he did." And then there was Ambrose Kellett, who said nothing at all. In the early evening, Mrs. Elspeth Farrow fed her pigeons and noticed that two men crossed the green who rarely crossed anywhere. One wore a good hat, the other did not. They spoke only briefly. They spoke too closely. She did not report this. She stored it, which was sometimes more dangerous. That night, something entirely unexpected occurred. A small fire was found behind the lodge hall, not large enough to raise an alarm, not fierce enough to attract the brigade, just enough to blacken a patch of wall and destroy what little rubbish had been gathered there. Among it, Lovegrove later found the scorched remains of paper. He did not need to tell Purbright it was the heart of a book, not a public burning, a careful one. By now, the town's earlier certainty had collapsed into something less comfortable. The story of a foolish stranger and a bell rope had become crowded with men who had too much to hide, and logs that had vanished politely. At the vestry, the bell ringers sat in silence. No one suggested ringing. No one suggested anything. They drank tea that tasted of nothing. Purbright walked through the high street late that evening, his footsteps absorbed by cobbles that had heard worse things than they revealed. The silence felt wrong, not peaceful, manufactured. Behind 4 proper front doors, 4 men found sleep unexpectedly difficult. Denton rehearsed his denials. Crisp folded and unfolded his hands. Kellett stared at the ceiling. Hawley listened for sounds that did not arrive, and one of them, though none would have admitted it, began to understand that the stranger's death had not been the problem. The problem had been the return. The wrong man had come at the wrong time, with the wrong questions. And now, somewhere between a missing logbook and a quiet fire, the town had entered a deeper stage of discomfort. Purbright, alone in his small office, held the brass token in his hand and considered the new shape of the silence. Someone had gone to effort. Someone was frightened, and someone, by their careful burning and silent walking, had just revealed that the truth was closer than anyone in Flaxborough found polite. The second disturbance of the case had passed without shouting, and somehow that made it worse. The morning after the small fire behind the lodge hall arrived with an air of behaved exhaustion. Flaxborough did not discuss the scorch mark directly. It would have been improper to admit that it existed with such enthusiasm. Instead, it manifested in smaller adjustments: curtains closed a little earlier, greetings shortened by a syllable, the butcher's jokes left unfinished. Purbright felt the change at once. He walked the high street slowly, observing the way shopkeepers stood a fraction deeper in their doorways, as if their premises had grown less certain of themselves. Human nature, he reflected, was rarely violent in Flaxborough. It was careful, it accumulated, it kept accounts that were never written down. He paused by the church gate, watching a sparrow rearrange a twig in a way that suggested a persistence untroubled by secret meetings. It struck him that birds were fortunate creatures. Inside the station he brewed tea that tasted faintly of metal and sat with it untouched while he considered the town's character with the patience of a man rereading a puzzle with pieces that had begun to look less innocent. Men like Hawley did not act from passion, they acted from principle, which was far more dangerous. Men like Denton did not shout, they endured. Men like Crisp smiled because they had long ago discovered that smiling was cheaper than forgiveness. And then there was Kellett, who cleaned floors and noticed everything and understood less than he feared. This was not a crime of sudden hands, it was a crime of years. The stranger, whoever he had been, had brought something with him. Not a weapon, not even a threat. Only memory, and perhaps expectation. Purbright leaned back in his chair, hands folded, and allowed his thoughts to wander politely in directions he did not share with the people who asked him questions. At the railway station, Wilkes told the story again to a porter who had never heard it, but pretended he had. Each telling grew more confident, more distant from the truth. He seemed wrong somehow, Wilkes said. He meant useful. That afternoon, Purbright walked to the edge of town where the hedges grew careless and houses stopped trying so hard. He came upon the narrow path Mrs. Farrow used for her pigeon feedings and paused, letting the air arrange his thoughts. He considered the tower, the rope that had not frayed, the scuff mark that had been returned to, like a thought that could not be forgotten. He imagined the stranger's hands, not struggling, not clawing, resting. Human beings, he decided, rarely protested when they believed they were doing the last decent thing left to them. In the vestry, Arthur Pelham sat alone, polishing nothing in particular. He felt as if his life had slipped slightly to the left, and he could not straighten it again. Across town, Denton walked the length of his front room 5 times, stopped, and then began again. Hawley sat with a newspaper he did not read, listening to the silence outside his door, and wondering if it had always made that particular sound. Crisp ate his supper and found it tasteless. Back in the station, Lovegrove felt the change in the air but could not describe it. He was used to burglaries, sudden tempers, broken windows. This thing, whatever it was, behaved like a thought no one wished to finish. "Do you think," he asked carefully, "that we'll ever get a straight answer, sir?" Purbright considered the cold tea. "Straight answers," he said gently, "are for straight lives, Lovegrove." That evening, Mrs. Farrow walked by the tower again and noticed that the grass near the wall had been flattened, not by feet, but by waiting. Someone had stood there more than once, shifting their weight, looking up. She did not tell anyone. She did not have to. When darkness gathered, it did so in layers. Curtains were drawn. Lamps were adjusted. Doors were checked twice. Purbright stood once more beneath the tower and rested his hand against the cool stone. People, he thought, were rarely wicked all at once. They narrowed, little by little, choice by choice, until there was only one thing left to do, and even that felt polite. He recalled Hawley's face, set in a smile that was always a fraction too stiff, Denton's voice, soft and edged, Crisp's careful eyes, Kellett's tired ones. The stranger had not come for adventure, he had come for closure, and the town, which prized closure in all things, had not been able to afford it. By the time Purbright returned to his office, he no longer thought of the case as a sudden death. He thought of it as a long habit that had finally been interrupted. Somewhere, in some neat and carpeted room, someone was practicing a version of calm that did not come naturally. Someone was preparing to be asked a polite question, and somewhere, in the darkness of the tower, the rope that had not frayed hung quietly, knowing more than it would ever be asked to say. The slow tide of human nature had reached its turning point, and Flaxborough, in its careful sleep, shifted very slightly toward the moment it had spent so much energy avoiding. It was Sunday afternoon when Inspector Purbright decided to be courteous on purpose. The occasion was harmless enough. Tea at the vicarage. Reverend Hargreaves, who enjoyed small social gatherings because they gave shape to otherwise shapeless worries, had invited a modest selection of men whose faces suggested respectability and whose interiors suggested unfinished business. They sat in high-backed chairs and drank tea that had been overbrewed in a spirit of seriousness. Biscuits softened in saucers. A plate of cake remained politely untouched, which in Flaxborough meant it would certainly be discussed. Hawley attended as he attended everything that allowed him to be seen. Denton came because he did not know how to refuse. Crisp arrived early and looked faintly embarrassed by his own punctuality. Kellett, invited as caretaker rather than guest, hovered near the wall like a thought no one wished to finish. Purbright arrived last, which made the moment his. He chose his chair without hurry, folded his hands, and accepted his tea with the gratitude of a man who never objected to anything directly. Conversation settled into the comfortable grooves of the town, the weather, the state of the railway timetable, the inexplicable behaviour of pigeons. Then Purbright spoke. "Mr. Hawley," he said gently, as though offering praise, "you have such an excellent memory for dates." Hawley sat a little straighter. "I try to be precise," he replied. "I wondered," Purbright continued, "if you might help me with something that's been troubling my own weaker efforts." Hawley's smile thinned. "In what way?" Purbright set his cup down carefully. "I've been trying to remember who first suggested that the stranger's death was a misadventure. It was a very sensible thought. I admired it." He let the words rest. Hawley shifted a fraction of an inch. "I believe," Hawley said, "we all came naturally to that conclusion." "Of course," Purbright agreed. "Naturally?" He turned to Denton. "You've always been a steady man, Mr. Denton. I wondered how you found the courage to be so certain so quickly." Denton blinked. "I don't like fuss," he said. "No one does," Purbright replied. "That's what makes fuss so difficult." Crisp's fingers touched the edge of his saucer, then retreated. "And you, Mr. Crisp," Purbright added with mild admiration, "you were very restrained. That sort of restraint takes practice." Crisp flushed faintly. "I don't like to speculate," he said. "I'm sure you don't," said Purbright. The air altered slightly, as polite air often did when something impolite had been dressed as a compliment. Kellett watched the carpet. Hawley reached for his cup, missed it, and corrected himself. Outside, a clock sounded the quarter hour with modest authority. Purbright leaned back, folding his hands loosely. "It's curious," he said, without raising his voice, "how communities decide on explanations. They seem to arrive at them in a very similar way to committees. Someone suggests, others agree, and then it becomes natural. Silence moved gently through the room. Hargreaves, sensing the change and disapproving of it, pretended to examine the cake. Hawley cleared his throat. "You're suggesting something improper, Inspector?" "Not at all," Purbright replied. "I'm admiring the process." He shifted slightly. "And yet I find myself troubled by a small point of timing." Hawley's eyes hardened. "What timing?" "The time when a man might have been better accompanied." There was no drama in the words, no heat, just the simple placing of an idea like a glass on a table. Denton moved as if to speak, then stopped. Crisp smiled, which was a mistake. Kellett's hands tightened on nothing. "It's only a thought," Purbright went on mildly. "But it interests me how regularly certain men appear connected with places rather than actions." Hawley's voice came out more sharply than he would have liked. "This is very unfair." "I hope so," Purbright said. He looked down at his tea, which had gone cold. "Otherwise," he added, "it might be accurate." The room explored several different kinds of silence. The useful kind, the frightened kind, and the kind that wondered if it would ever be useful again. Later, as coats were put on and polite farewells rehearsed, Denton lingered. "You're very observant, Inspector," he said. "I try to be appreciative," Purbright replied. "Appreciative of what?" "The effort people make." That night, the effects of the question spread quietly. Hawley sat in his front room and found the ticking of the clock too loud. Denton washed the same cup twice. Crisp stood at the window and watched nothing with particular attention. Kellett stayed late at the lodge hall without knowing why. Purbright walked once more to the tower. He did not enter. He did not need to. He had watched 3 men attempt to look natural under the pressure of courtesy, and one of them had succeeded just a little too poorly. In the darkness of the street, he let the knowledge sit where it wished. The test had not been a trap. It had been a kindness. It had allowed the guilty man to show himself without being accused. Now the next step would not be sudden. It would not be dramatic. It would be contained, shaped, and executed with the same politeness that Flaxborough valued so highly. Someone, somewhere, had just realized that polite questions could be more dangerous than any shout. And someone, very quietly, had begun to come undone. The explanation was given, as such things should be in Flaxborough, without ceremony. It took place in the municipal reading room, a space designed for the thoughtful consumption of newspapers and the careful avoidance of confrontation. The long table smelt of dusted oak and public responsibility. The chairs had been arranged to suggest equality, though no one believed in it. Hawley arrived first, wearing the hat that had once displeased Mrs. Farrow. Denton came next, carrying a stiffness that had not been earned by age. Crisp hovered outside the door for several seconds before entering with the air of a man who suspected that carpets might be listening. Kellett stood near the wall, present without belonging. Purbright closed the door himself. The click of the latch sounded final without being dramatic. He did not stand, he did not pace. He sat with his hands folded and regarded them as though they were men he had met socially and found faintly puzzling. "I should like," he said calmly, "to explain what I think happened." No one objected. Objections required confidence. "There was a man," Purbright continued, "who belonged to your lodge for a short while some years ago." Denton's fingers tightened. "He was not quite like you," Purbright went on. "Not local, not fitted, a man who thought ideas were things that could be spoken aloud." Hawley's eyes narrowed. "He had habits you didn't care for," Purbright said. He corrected, he remembered. He did not let small things pass, which in a town like this is not always considered polite. Crisp shifted. You removed him, Purbright said gently. Quietly, properly, a resignation suggested, a door closed, a confidence required. Kellett's face lost colour. And what you didn't expect, Purbright added, was that he would keep thinking about you. The room grew smaller. He joined another society, Purbright continued. Real antiquarians, real questions, real persistence. He found your old building, he found your old silence, and he came back. Hawley found his voice. That doesn't make him dead, he said. No, Purbright agreed. He lifted the brass token from his pocket and placed it on the table. It makes him remembered. Denton swallowed. He came to see you, Purbright said, not in anger, not to shout. He came with a belief that men, when faced calmly, might admit things. Crisp laughed, but the sound broke halfway. Men like you, Purbright added, do not admit. They said nothing. He stood by the tower, Purbright went on. He waited. He was met. His eyes moved, not quickly, but precisely to Hawley. You spoke with him, Purbright said. Hawley lifted his chin. He threatened us, he replied. Did he? Purbright asked lightly. Or did he simply remember? There was a pause. He said he would expose us, Hawley said. There it was. The word justified much. He was taken up the
tower, Purbright said. Not forced, persuaded. You have always been good at persuasion. Hawley's mouth tightened. You told him you would explain, that you would clear things. Silence. You asked him to show you the mechanism, Purbright said. The rope, the beam, the old logbook. You made it appear educational. Crisp made a sound he did not recognize as pain. He believed you, Purbright went on. He did not fight you. He did not struggle. He thought you were at last being decent. Kellett's hands trembled. He stood where you told him, Purbright said, very softly now. And when the rope was placed, he thought it was demonstration. He looked at Hawley. You pushed. The word was not loud, it did not echo, it did not need to. Hawley exhaled slowly like a man who had been holding his breath for years. We didn't plan to kill him, he said. No, Purbright agreed. You planned to end inconvenience. Denton stared at the table. Crisp whispered, we thought it would look like an accident. And it almost did, Purbright said. He leaned back. You would have had it accepted too. Flaxborough likes useful explanations. He let that rest. The trouble, he added, was that you kept tidying. Hawley frowned. You returned, Purbright said. You checked the rope. You took the logbook. You burned the record. You couldn't stop managing. Kellett covered his face. You made it worse, Purbright said. Not by what you did to the man, but by how carefully you tried to forget him. No one argued. There was nowhere for argument left to sit. So now, Hawley said quietly, what happens? Purbright considered him. You'll be taken into custody, he said. There will be no handcuffs unless you insist on theatre. Hawley managed a thin smile. We were only trying to keep things tidy. I know, Purbright said. Outside, the town continued to exist. Curtains moved, kettles sang. A child dropped a hoop and chased it without fear of what quiet rooms held. Lovegrove waited beyond the door, already understanding from the quality of the silence inside. Purbright gathered his hat. You should come along now, he said gently. Hawley rose. Denton followed him. Crisp hesitated, then moved. Kellett remained where he was, too tired to pretend he had never known. As the latch clicked open, Flaxborough gained its truth in the least dramatic manner possible. No crowds, no shouting, just four men stepping into consequences with the same dignity they had used to avoid them. And Purbright, watching them go, reflected without satisfaction that politeness, when properly applied, usually outlived violence. Only one small chapter of the town remained, and it would be written quietly. Flaxborough resumed itself with admirable discipline. There were no banners, no public meetings, no long looks exchanged across the high street. The town did not enjoy fuss,
even when fuss had recently been required. Instead, it restored itself through adjustments so subtle they barely counted as actions. Curtains returned to their habitual angles. Shop bells rang with their former crispness. The butcher's jokes, which had faltered briefly, regained their earlier confidence. At St. Ethelred's, the bells waited. They were not rung for a week. This was not due to fear so much as decorum. The ropes hung obediently, the beam held its silence, and the tower acquired once more the dignity of a place that had seen something it would not discuss. Reverend Hargreaves rewrote his Sunday remarks 3 times and finally chose a version that contained neither accident nor mystery, but merely a period of reflection. The congregation accepted this gratefully. The men who had once stood in the quiet reading room did not return home that night. Hawley wore his good hat for the journey. Denton buttoned his coat too tightly. Crisp's hands shook only once, and then remained still. Kellett was not taken anywhere. He simply faded back into his duties, which now felt older than he could remember. No crowds gathered. The handcuffs were not seen. Flaxborough liked it that way. Mrs. Elspeth Farrow fed her pigeons and noticed that the grass by the tower began slowly to raise itself again. It is difficult, even for grass, to remember the shape of waiting once no one stands there. She said nothing to anyone. She very rarely did. At Hartley's, Mrs. Crabbe returned to talking about gloves. The butcher's shop developed a sudden enthusiasm for pickling. Mr. Wilkes at the railway buffet told fewer stories, and when he did, they contained less excitement. Arthur Pelham went back to polishing things that did not need polishing. One Wednesday evening, the bell ringers climbed the tower again. They did so with good posture and only the faintest nervousness. Harold Timms pulled the first rope hesitantly as one might test the mood of a large animal. The bell sounded. It was exactly as it had always been, and it was not. Down in the station, Purbright returned to paperwork. The files closed with the polite sound of completion, not triumph. The brass token lay in his drawer, wrapped in paper, like something that had served its purpose and now deserved not to be stared at. Lovegrove hovered near the doorway, restless. "Strange business, sir," he said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "You think they'll settle again?" "They will behave," Purbright said, which is not quite the same thing. Outside his window, the town made its ordinary noises, footsteps, wheels, the sharp, comforting snap of newspaper being folded. There were a few changes too small to announce themselves. The lodge hall remained closed, its windows dull with dust. No notices curled on its board anymore, no lectures were planned. The place seemed to exhale for the first time in years. The tower logbook, never recovered, became a story people told, themselves quietly, that it had been misplaced, that it had rotted, that it had never mattered. Nothing in Flaxborough was ever said to matter. In the quiet of a late afternoon, Purbright walked past St. Ethelred's and paused. He did not go in. He did not look up. He merely stood for a moment, letting the air arrange itself back into something that resembled peace. The bells were silent then. He thought briefly of the man who had stood where the rope was fed into waiting hands, of the calm with which he must have looked at familiar wood and unfamiliar faces. of the faith, misplaced perhaps, that a town full of polite men could find honesty when asked quietly enough. He reflected, too, that people were not cruel in the way storms were cruel. They were cruel in the way furniture was moved too often with small, repeated, careful actions that eventually left a mark. Behind curtained windows, life ticked back towards new normalities. Hawley's chair was empty in his front room. Denton's pipe went unsmoked. Crisp's careful routine points no longer matched the hours, and yet the town did not collapse. It simply adjusted, as only towns like Flaxborough could. That evening, Purbright sat at his desk until the lamplight turned everything into softer shapes. He filled in the last lines of a report that said everything necessary and explained nothing loudly. He wrote, "Conclusion, deliberate act, conducted under appearance of cooperation, motivated by old grievance and fear of exposure." He did not underline it. He closed the file and placed it where files went when they were not expected to be asked about again. Outside, a child laughed. Somewhere, a kettle boiled. A door closed with a gentle sound that suggested it knew how to behave. Purbright put on his hat and stepped out into the street. Flaxborough met him as it always had, quiet, tidy, and faintly absurd. The bells of St. Ethelred's, satisfied with their own survival, remained silent. And in that silence the town very politely folded its secrets back into itself and continued, as it always did, to appear entirely unchanged.